So that's what Jesus does in this situation. He goes up to the widow and he says, "Don't cry." His heart went out to her. And he shared these comforting words. But then he goes beyond words and he shows her that he is the Lord who can wipe away all tears from our eyes and can bring the breath of life to conquer the sting of death. He can change the most bleakest situation into one of great hope and joy. And so because Jesus had compassion, he goes up to this coffin and he touches it. But it's not just any touch. Those hands of Jesus had the power to raise the dead, to bring life from death. And so this man sits up and he begins to talk to his mother. And all the people were filled with awe, because the one who was once proclaimed by the angels upon his birth to be Emmanuel, God with us, had now come and backed up all of that big talk about him. This God with us, Jesus Christ, had compassion that motivated him to change the reality of the situation. And if you read through the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you see that Jesus was absolutely consumed with going to the downtrodden and changing them, and going to them and picking them up and making them new. He often had choice words of condemnation for the powerful of his day, but for the poor and the sick and the needy and the dying, even the dead, Jesus had great compassion. You see, Jesus doesn't delight in those who see no need for him. He comes for the poor in spirit, and then he makes this bold promise that as we come to him humble and meek, he can make us rich by the power of his love. And that's why I get saddened by a lot of the talk I hear when people are passing away, or even at funerals I attend nowadays. See, it's as though we forget a lot of what we've learned or proclaimed about Jesus in the past at those times. And also we kind of like to change around some of the things about people's life, hoping that a few glowing words can overcome the reality of what was true about them. But a lot of times I've found all that talk really can't be backed up with the truth. I shared this story on Good Friday afternoon, but most of you either came that evening or were out of town or not here, and so I think it bears just a little bit of a recap. I think it fits. I have a pastor friend from Minnesota who had to come and visit me a year or so back because his grandfather, who lived in Michigan, had passed away. And he talked about his grandpa in this really honest way. It was a very uncomfortable, honest way. He shared that his grandpa had been an adulterer, that he had deserted his family for a long period of time, and that his own children had even turned their back on him for many, many years. He was a compulsive gambler and a liar. And he denied Jesus, both with his words and with his life. But it's the culturally proper thing to do, to provide some sort of service in our day and age. And so the family gathered together, and much to my pastor friend's dismay, and this will make sense in just a little bit, even though it might not sound so good at first. Much to his dismay, they did find a pastor who was willing to perform a service. And he kind of did it in the name of false compassion. You see, it's never compassionate. It is never compassionate to ignore the truth, to deny reality. But this pastor agreed to not hold a funeral, but a celebration of life. And that's what it was called. And my friend said that's exactly what they did. They celebrated life. The only problem for him as he was sitting there was that he kept thinking, this isn't my grandpa's life that we're celebrating. Decades of it seemed to be edited out. This false compassion led to words to be spoken that weren't really true. You know, should I pass away while I'm still your pastor? I hope that won't be the case, but should that happen, and you get some ringer in here to preach in my absence, feel free to tell him to have a field day. Tell him that he can say this guy who was once here had a penchant for food that wasn't really good for him. Feel free to talk about my shortcomings in many areas as you've come to know them, how certainly could have been more patient. No doubt there are times could have chosen words more wisely. Certainly could have been a better husband or father. There's no doubt there's any number of flaws that could be preached about. Because the truth of my life says that I have in fact practiced what he would preach. And you know, here's something else. At some of your funerals, I promise to talk about those same shortcomings and flaws. And I know that doesn't sound very compassionate. And some of you are wondering, well, I hope they have my funeral somewhere else then. But believe me on this. It's then and only then that real compassion can be shared. Because it's only then that words can be shared that actually do match up with the action that has been taken. But you see, it's not our action. It's the action of the same hands of our Lord Jesus Christ that touched that coffin and brought that widow's son back to life. But this time, those hands are not displaying power. This time, we will talk about hands that are weak, that are bloody, that are dying. The time eventually came for this almighty, this all-powerful Son of God to practice what he had preached. And throughout his ministry, he had preached that the time was going to come when he would die for the sins of the world, for you and for me. And so his hands gave up that power, and he spread them out in love, because his heart goes out to all of us. He has compassion for us. When he could have had spite, he instead chose to have compassion for all those things we've said we'd do, but we haven't quite followed through on. He had compassion for the work of our hands for which we should be ashamed, the raised fists in anger, the abhorrent internet sites that have been clicked on, the neighbor to whom we've failed to extend a helping hand. Every one of those sins, every one of them, declares us unworthy to dwell in the presence of a holy and righteous God who wants nothing to do with sin. They justify him just wiping his hands of us.